All right, we are going to start with Fort Sumter, which took place April 12th, 1861. So here's a few pictures I want you to take a look at first. So here's the actual fort, okay? And it's on an island. It's in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And this is right after Lincoln's inauguration. I think he'd only been in office maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. So what happened was this is in South Carolina, which is in a Confederate state. It's in Confederate territory. So the Union still has the fort, okay? The Federalists. So Lincoln wanted to resupply the fort with supplies, typical military supplies, food, ammo, things of that nature. And the problem was it was in the Confederacy. So Confederate ships did not want to let the Federalists or the Union resupply the fort, which makes sense, right? But what ended up happening is that after 34 hours of artillery bombardment, of cannon fire, of all of that, the commanding officer and 86 soldiers inside the fort surrendered finally on April 13th. There were actually no casualties. A couple of the guys, I think, got wounded due to shrapnel from the cannons just blasting through the walls. But one of the main things I want you to take away from this is that this was the first actual battle. Okay, this showed that the South was willing to be violent, it was willing to fight for the Confederacy. And at first, and this is crazy in hindsight, everyone thought that this was going to be over like that. They thought that this war was going to take no time at all, back to normal by Christmas time. But that obviously was not to be, those of you who genuinely know history. So the problem was all these other forts surrounding Fort Sumter were taken over by the Confederacy, as well as the Confederacy had ships in the harbor firing on poor little old Fort Sumter until they finally had to surrender. This is one of the most famous images you'll see from it. You won't see battlefield photography until about 1862, and this is in 1861. So again, the takeaways from this is Fort Sumter, and this is important because it is the first battle of the Civil War. Again, I'm going to try and go over just the basics for these notes for you guys. And please be jotting down a couple of things. I will have these slides as well as the videos on Classroom, but here we get to First Bull Run, or as it was known in the South, First Manassas. This was in July of 1861. And it's not like the armies just chilled out from April till July. A lot happened. One of the things that happened is that Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers, and quite a few volunteers. So within this time frame, the rest of the South decided to secede. So originally, let me go back to this map real quick. Originally, the first states to secede was South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Deep South, okay? The Cotton Belt states. But after Lincoln called for militia or volunteers to the Union Army, um, the rest of the southern states saw that as aggression. And within a couple of months, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia all ended up seceding as well. So between Fort Sumter and First Manassas, you have Robert E. Lee becoming commander of the Confederacy and resigning from the Federal Army. You have General McDowell. Okay, we haven't gotten to McClellan yet. You have Union General McDowell. Excuse me. He was one of the main generals at the time. One of the main issues the Union had was their generals weren't the best. They were good guys. They were all from West Point, but just as we know, some leaders are better than others. So the Union went through quite a few commanding officers at the beginning, well, throughout the war, really, but we'll get to that later. So this was the first major battle, and this is why it is so important, because this was the one where They were actually fighting each other in a field. This was pretty close to DC. Okay, this was so close to Washington that civilians brought picnics, right? And they thought it was going to be a great spectator sport. They brought picnics and blankets and binoculars and all that jazz and decided to sit and watch the battle, see what was going to happen. And because they ended up being in the way of the Union retreat, the civilians, actually caused more casualties for the Union. So this is one of the first large scale battles. The Civil War had an amount of soldiers that no war up until this point had previously seen. Okay. Absolutely staggering numbers of both soldiers as well as casualties. So for this first battle, and this is a fairly small one, um, 2,800 or 28,500 Union versus 32,000 Confederate soldiers, for a grand total of just under 5,000 casualties, which is not okay. So 5,000 casualties, wounded, missing, or dead, is of course a huge number. But relatively speaking to the casualties that we're going to talk about later, this is nothing. Okay, this happened in a couple of hours at Gettysburg. So the Union retreated, and this was a Confederate victory. So why do we care? This battle showed that the war would not be quick and easy like they hoped. This battle showed that there were going to be an astronomical amount of casualties, that there were going to be very large armies involved. And one of the other important things about this battle is that well, I guess I should say General Thomas Jackson got his nickname Stonewall at the Battle of Bull Run or First Manassas. So, and again, here's a portrait of it. And one of the other things to remember, these battle lines were they were off and on for miles for a lot of these. So it was actually really difficult for the head generals like McClellan or Lee or Jackson or whomever to really keep tabs on everything because okay, so this scale, 500 meters. Okay, this is a lot going on here. So anytime you see these little rectangles are the different brigades, excuse me. And you have the locations, you have the names. So here's Sherman. We've talked about him before. Um, Johnston, Jackson. So these are kind of the troop movements, and the arrows show which way they went. And the Union ended up retreating under heavy casualties. All right, so Shiloh. Also, if you notice anything in blue or I thought I had a link on that one. There are links strewn throughout this, as well as links about the battles in the Civil War fake book that I posted last week on here. So feel free to look at those videos. They might help you understand the battles a little bit more. There are hundreds of videos on the Civil War just on YouTube itself. A lot of them were pretty long or pretty old, but by all means, have at it. All right, so Shiloh is in Tennessee, so this was in the Western Theater, and two of the biggest generals that came out of the Western Theater early on in the war was um, General Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. So this was crazy. So the Confederacy surprises Grant and his troops, and they completely surrounded the Union. The Confederacy had a really good chance to essentially destroy most of the Union army at the Battle of Shiloh, but it didn't happen. The main area of fighting was a sunken road that they called the Hornet's Nest. Okay, what do you know about Hornet's Nest? It's pretty busy, pretty chaotic. So here's a sunken road. Okay, this would have been the site of the Hornet's Nest. And again, we don't have a lot of very reliable photographs yet because it is still a little bit early, but we're getting there. There were a total of 110,000 soldiers total. Okay, so between the two sides. And that again is bigger than Beaver Stadium, which is this one down here. Okay, This is 107,000. So there was a little bit more than the stadium's worth of men in this one battle. And this was the first battle with really large casualties. Okay, so do you remember the ones at First Manassas? They were only around what, like 5,000? This battle itself, in 2 days, there are almost 24,000 casualties. This ended up being a Union victory. This was one of the only Union victories early in the war. And why do we care? Again, first battle with large casualties. This really showed how horrific this war was going to be. The South took Grant by surprise and almost destroyed his army on the first day. Grant got a lot of flack for that, but he ended up being, of course, the savior of the Union. So Grant apparently learned his lesson after the Battle of Shiloh. And moving on to the 7 Days battles. Now, you will hear these called, there are umpteen trillion different names for this because 7 Days battles, guess what? There were 7 battles in 7 days. This is also called the Peninsula Campaign because this was around the peninsula of Richmond. Okay, so Richmond's coastline and all these rivers and things like that. So here are the different battles. One of the biggest ones was that Seven Pines. Okay, this was a couple of days. A couple of them were a couple of days. And this was a huge thing because it showed that the Union was not able to take Richmond early in the war. Okay, so this is June through July of 1862. The war goes through 1865. Okay, this was one of Lee's first times to shine for the South to defend his homeland of Virginia. And the main Union general was McClellan. Okay, and his whole thing was to try and capture Richmond because, capturing capitals in war, like I said, it's essentially capture the flag. You want to get the capitals, you want to take over their government, you want to destroy the morale. There were 104,000 Union troops. There were 92,000 Confederate troops. There was a total of about 36,000 casualties over these 7 days. And this starts McClellan's tendencies to be overly cautious. Okay. Throughout the war, and if you watch the videos or you read the fake book, McClellan always thought that he was outnumbered. He was extremely cautious, which a lot of people make him out to be one of the worst generals in history, and I'm a history teacher. I am not a military scholar. I admit that freely. But a lot of historians really do think that if McClellan would have been more decisive, a little bit more active earlier on in the war, that it would not have drug on so long. So McClellan, as per usual, overestimated the size of the Confederate forces and decided not to attack. And the end result was an absolute crushing defeat for the Union. The Confederacy just wiped the floor with them, and the Union had to retreat back to DC, licking their wounds and getting well again. So, why this battle is important? Because it showed how McClellan was overly cautious, and within a couple of years, or a year, Lincoln fires him. This was Lee's first major victory, and this is also important because the Union, even though they have more troops, they have more money, they have more supplies, they have more factories, they have more guns, they have more ammo, they have more ability to transport everything because of their railroads. They still were not able to end the war early by capturing Richmond. Okay, so again, um, here's some of the Gaines Mill. That was the one that we'll look at that one later. But here's the battle map picture. And on to, for the last one today, Second Manassas, okay, or Second Bull Run. So the North calls it Bull Run, the South labeled it as Manassas. And again, this is in Virginia. Most of the battles take place in Virginia. Okay, remember back to that first map. So this is in August of 1862. The major commanders were General Pope for the Union versus Lee for the South. And the North was doing pretty well, but the South came back with a huge counterattack. But the Union was able to hold on long enough for it not to be destroyed, although they had to retreat. You see a pattern here of Union retreating. This battle had about 70,000 Union troops, 55,000 Confederates, and a grand total of little over PPG Paints Arena worth of casualties. Why do we care? This was another large battle that was a complete Confederate victory. And this was the first time that Lee is able to lead his troops on the offensive going north instead of just defending Richmond. So far, the Union, so if we were looking at this again as sporting events, the Union has won 2, lost 5, and we'll call one a draw. The Confederates have won 5, lost 2, and we'll call one a draw. How could the North, that, like I said, remember back to that background assignment I gave you last week, the North has the advantage of the number of troops, the number of money that it has, the ability to have guns and ammo produced for them because they have the factories. They have the textiles. They don't have the raw cotton, but they have the textiles. They have more railroads. So how could the Union be doing this poorly? So that's something that I want to leave you with, pondering that question. We'll talk about that first next time. And next time we will move on to, oh, those are the answers. Oh no. So the next time we will move on to Antietam or Sharpsburg, which is one of the biggest battles of the war that we will talk about a little bit more than these other ones that we've gone through pretty quickly. All right, so you are to ponder and tell me, how could the Union be doing so poorly at this point in the war? All right, we'll pick up here next video.